Previously in Hedge Knights, the search party trio realized they were succumbing to pollution exposure and detoured north in hopes of finding Salix Groves. They found a marsh and settled in, planned on building a lodge they could use for future caravans. And they fortified their lodge, started stone cutting for stronger walls, and relocated Salix trees closer to the structure. Tangier started mining skyfallen stones, hoping that either Lazarus or Megahoof would find a use for the ore. Episode 24: Rescue. The trio in the way station felt ready to rebuild their temporary shelter in hopes it would remain standing and could be used for future travel. They had amassed enough stone to tear down the wooden walls and replace them with brick and mortar, while also incorporating air loops into the structure. Sapo thought they'd be healthy enough to endure more travel, heading deeper into the Ryza forest to search for survivors, meaning they only had a day or two to prepare the lodge. They worked quickly, and Dave said they had enough brick that both Sapo and Arauco could try their hand at masonry. Wasting material was not a concern. Megahoof knew Tangier planned on mining all of the gold ore she could find in the glade, and decided to start investigating ways to incorporate the gold into armor, allowing Lazarus to forge masterworks if he felt up to the task. He also thought that the Salix trees were managing to keep up with the pollution surplus, and suggested to the other atlets it might be time to start cleaning the prayer room, the last area unpurified within the keep. The trio finished off the berry medley meals and now relied on the preserved Mackie. Sapo warned that if they didn't depart for Fallen Settlement soon, they'd likely run out of food and have to return to the Bison Keep, having failed to actually search for survivors. Dave hastened his designs for a protected way station and decided to build only a few sections of arrow loops instead of fortified gate merlins. Arrow loops and properly fortified walls took time. He realized they only had time for basic stone walls and a few arrow looped sections, so the grand way station he had dreamed in his head would have to wait for another day. Sapo needed to move 2 of the 3 Salix trees further from the lodge as Dave's fortification projects likely encroached upon the tree's root structures. The other 2 could slowly see Dave's design come together and approve with the plans to add stone gates and arrow loops. The trio knew that they would require some sort of rest area between the main keep and the western forest, and building a permanent structure to serve as that rest area would provide reliability and security to an otherwise dangerous trek. As Lazarus harvested the wheat, Megahoof told the other atlets that he needed the wheat stored on shelves instead of processed into flour with the windmill. The wheat could easily be stored in bushels and milled when it was needed. Processing it with the windmill would limit the amount of hay chaff that they could get from the yield. Now that most of the other tasks in the way station glade were finished, Sapo and Arelco joined Dave and attempted to help him build the stone walls. Despite having spent countless days cutting stone, neither Sapo nor Arelco were any good at using those cut stones to build or construct. Despite their obvious lack of skill and competency, Dave reassured that all of their work would be inspected to make sure it didn't compromise the structure. Tangier continued mining the rare ore around the glade and was nearly finished with one of the sky rocks in the marshes. She would need to enlist the help of the other adlets to haul all of the precious ore back to the keep before it sunk into the marshy soil. About half the lodge had been retrofitted with stone walls, and Arelco worked through the night clinging bricks and slinging mortar. After a short stint attempting to build the southern slab gate, he decided to take a break and instead work to lay timber roof overhead, a task he could more easily manage. Sappho awoke and joined Arelco in their abysmal attempt to construct sound walls. The last of the walls were finished by Dave, and he asked Arelco if he wanted a break from gate construction. Dave knew he could manage the task far more quickly than Arelco, but instead of stating the obvious, he thought offering him reprieve would be a friendlier method to getting the project finished on time. The way station had been improved, and the trio were ready to depart. There was no time to waste, as they were already behind schedule, running low on both food and time left before autumn. The trio packed up the bison, but in their haste had forgotten to take their bedrolls or extinguish the small hearth, and raced westward in search of survivors, leaving behind a sturdy and vacant lodge. The prayer room's purification was coming along nicely. About half of the timber floors were cleaned of pollution. The beauty of the room was far easier to see without the blighted gloom. The adlets piled the golden ores into a barrel next to the smelter and prepared to cast ingots for future use. The search party pressed deeper into the Rhiza forest, making sure to leave as few tracks as possible while crossing yet another major roadway, likely frequented by monsters. The nearby shallow river basin was easy to ford, the water was barely knee-deep. The time spent recovering in the waystation glade offered the trio renewed vigor, allowing them to make great progress in such a short period of time. Lazarus was excited about the new ore his wife had mined and asked Megoof if he had any insights about how to incorporate it into weapons or armor. Megoof reassured him that it was the singular focus of his studies, and he'd have some prospective answers soon. The first batch of gold ingots were nearly ready in the smelter. Lazarus was excited to work with the gold. There was no known gold sources back on Hellenora Island, and what little gold trinkets and baubles were owned were never melted down for metalwork, but instead passed down as heirlooms. For Adlets, working with steel and gold was the ultimate challenge. At least, it was during the height of the Adlet kingdoms, and Lazarus wanted the challenge of making masterpieces worthy of kings. The search party spotted a column of smoke rising on the horizon. The location of known visitor encampments was a result of massive plumes of pollution bellowing from their structures, but a singular column of smoke was far more likely to be from a campfire and not from a monster encampment. The trio decided to investigate with caution. If it was indeed an Adlet campfire sending out smoke signals, they were either desperate or foolish, as it was a very easy way to be spotted from a great distance. Lightning struck just north of the keep and set the Devilstrand patch ablaze. Lazarus rushed to put the fire out and called for backup in case he alone couldn't stop the spread. With Madzie's help, the two managed to stomp the fire out fairly quickly, and just as Judea arrived at the field, the fire was fully extinguished. Madzie enjoyed the silence of nighttime while she worked alone. She didn't particularly enjoy working around Arelco, the other night owl, because she thought he was rude and unsociable, and she thought he made as much noise as he could while he worked during the night, just to disturb the sleep of everyone else, clanking away with his hammer or chisel, or dropping stones loudly into the stockpiles. With Arelco gone, she could enjoy the sound of breeze through the trees and crackling of the hearth. She quietly tiptoed through the keep, attending her many chores, making sure not to wake the sleeping Adlets or bison. The Adlets had more wool than they knew what to do with, but despite the crippling surplus of bison wool, Lazarus continued to shear the herd to keep their woolly coats from getting matted and tangled. Lazarus then started the final harvest before autumn. Most of the pumpkins were ripe, and he'd not be sowing the field again until spring. He felt like putting on a little celebration of the final pumpkin harvest as a way to lift spirits before he asked the other Adlets to help haul the pumpkins to storage. Megahoof asked about the psychoid plot, and Lazarus reassured him that any day the northern patch would be ready to harvest, and likely the southern two patches would be ready before first frost as well. Out of nowhere, claps of thunder echoed throughout the glade. Nature's wild weather joined the party as the last to arrive. The search party arrived at the source of the smoke, a single campfire nestled in a polluted meadow with an Adlet huddled around it for warmth. The trio approached the Adlet, and it became clear the survivor was unwell. He shambled towards the trio, waving aggressively. Once the trio were within earshot, the sickly Adlet gasped the word trap as loudly as he could. Sapo reassured the old sick Adlet that they had arrived to rescue him, and that he should follow them as closely as he was able. Then Sapo readied himself for the battle ahead. Dave barked orders to attack the ambushers approaching from the west as he noticed the giant gray hornets starting to swarm in reaction to the ambush. Sapo noticed the older Adlet was wounded and sick, and after trying to converse with him, he thought he was hard of hearing as well. He let Arelco and Dave know he'd have a difficult time keeping pace with them, and to plan accordingly. After spotting a bow, Dave blitzed the next ambusher to stop it from firing arrows. Arelco and Sapo landed perfectly aimed strikes at the ambusher, instantly dropped it dead at Dave's feet. The remaining ambushers had killed the swarming hornets and fast approached from the east. Sapo yelled to the older Adlet to flee to the west and they'd cover his retreat. Dave told the other two to aim for whichever ambusher was in the lead, hoping to slow them down enough to withdraw and regroup with the bison. The trio fanned out into the marsh, and the maneuver seemingly confused the pursuing ambushers. Dave told the other Adlets he'd lure the ambushers away and regroup with them once he had covered his tracks. He then goaded the ambushers to chase him, knowing they were wounded and he was likely faster, and headed deeper south into the marsh away from his compatriots. Taunting had worked, the other three were no longer being chased. After losing his pursuers, Dave circled back towards the east and met up with the rest of the search party who had already fetched the bison. The older Adlet thanked Dave for his heroism and introduced himself as Klein. He explained to the trio that he had fled from the siege on Pennacook and ran out of food and resorted to foraging blighted berries that got him sick. He finally found a small purified meadow and passed out from exhaustion and malnutrition. When he awoke, he was beside a fire he hadn't built or lit and thought himself delirious or dreaming. Only when he saw the trio approach did it occur to him the fire was part of an elaborate trap built by monsters to lure even more survivors to their death, using him as bait. They asked Klein if he knew of any other survivors, and Klein regretfully said he did not know of any. In the chaotic fall of Pennacook, Adlets scattered as quickly as they could, and he had been alone for weeks. Klein then asked who the trio were. They were clearly not Pennacook. Dave explained that they were squires from a small keep nestled in an eastern forest, and they could offer him shelter and food. Klein then asked why the trio were risking traveling through the forest, and Dave explained he had worked for Pennacook as a mercenary from time to time and had put together a search party in hope of finding survivors. Sapo then beseeched Klein to share as much of his story as he could, despite how painful it might be. The trio needed to know how and why Pennacook fell to avoid the Bison Glade from meeting a similar fate. Klein described the fall of Penobscot and Wenwinock, a year and a half past, as the first of many events that brought down Pennacook. Dave had fled the siege of Penobscot and had witnessed Wenwinock burning from a distance, which ultimately was what brought him to the Bison Glade. 6 seasons ago, both proud communities were sacked at the same time, and refugees fled from the 2 settlements to Pennacook, which struggled to shelter them. Pennacook's security relied on its network of caves remaining hidden from the visitors, but the caves could only support a finite population. The added refugees made it ever more difficult to stay hidden from patrols and raid parties. Klein attributes Pennacook's fall as a result of mismanagement more than attacks from visitors. Pennacook needed to find additional shelters and divide their community to remain hidden, but failed to do so and finally incurred the wrath of a mighty siege. Klein said he was lucky to have escaped. He was out hunting and foraging for food when Pennacook was sacked, and while the other hunters rushed to aid survivors, he fled towards the boreal groves for refuge. He held his head in shame. Back in the keep, Lazarus started harvesting the cycwood leaves, and Megahoof couldn't wait to brew them into tea, despite it being a tedious and time-consuming process, because Megahoof knew that he'd soon have additional hybrid extracts distilled. The Adlets spotted another sprout of ambrosia bushes pushing up through the soil around some of the salix trees. Judea suggested they relocate the decaying bags of pollution away from the new sprouts, as pollution was now worth more than gold to the pollution-fighting Adlets. Klein shared more of his story. He had grown up on a small island west of the Ryza Forest called Banalium Point. When he was young, people started mysteriously disappearing from his community. Panic ensued, and his parents decided to build a makeshift canoe and risk their lives paddling east towards the mainland. His family found a small glade and managed to forage enough fresh berries and hunt enough toxalopes to sustain them. They lived in a cabin his father had built underground for several years, hiding from the monsters. One day, his mother spotted many well-armed adlets traveling with horses and cattle and rushed out to greet them. They were Pennacook traders, making a trip between local settlements, and the caravan guards welcomed the family to relocate to Pennacook if they wished. Their family joined the caravan, leaving behind the mystery of Benalium and the disappearance of its people. The rescue party finally made it to the way station to briefly regroup before their final trek back east to the Cotrao forest. Back in the Cotrao forest, many plague-rotten cougars prowled closer to the keep walls. Madzi sounded the alarm. The other adlets were still groggy and slowly rose to their feet, still unready to defend the walls. Dave woke the others in the way station. Their food dwindled, and soon autumn would be upon them, making foraging ever more difficult. He felt it necessary to depart at once despite not properly resting, and roused the others to pack the caravan immediately. Magoof ran to shut the main gate as the other archers fired arrows into the dark, hoping to strike the prowling cats. It was strange to see so many animals that were foreign to the boreal forest, and stranger still that they were all plague-feral. Animals were no real threat to the keep, unable to scale the curtain walls, but leaving them to prowl the grounds was far too dangerous. Putting the poor creatures out of their misery seemed more merciful as well. The travel-weary adlets struggled to pack the caravan, continually leaving behind provisions. Klein even managed to fall asleep in all the commotion, completely unbothered by the noise due to his hearing loss. Sappo wished he had time to cook up berry medley meals in preparation, but eating raw berries only posed a small risk of food poisoning. The archers finished defending against the adlet hunting cats and returned to their beds. After a quick nap, the travelers gathered what remained to be loaded onto the bison and departed the way station, heading eastward home. Thank you for tuning in to episode 24 of Hedge Knights Rescue. If you would like to support me as a content creator, please consider liking, subscribing, and sharing this content with your friends. If you would like to support me directly, a link to Patreon can be found in the description of this video, And if you would like to join my gaming community, I'll link to Discord as well. Thank you so very much for watching. A special thank you to my Patreon patrons, Twitch subscribers, and viewers like you that support the channel and made it all the way to the credits. Thank you so very much. Hope to catch you next episode. Farewell, fellow adlets.